Rimuru reincarnated into another world by Kischur. Boring. Rimuru had finally returned home, back to her own room, her old room, and let out a deep sigh. That was so boring, she groaned, flopping onto her bed like a ragdoll. The memory of the meeting still lingered, and she could feel the dullness seeping into her very soul. The grand meeting hall, filled with the kingdom's most powerful nobles, had been a battlefield of endless droning. Seated in her designated archduke's chair, Rimuru barely concealed her boredom, resting her chin in her palm with a vacant stare. She didn't react to the debates, didn't acknowledge the speeches, and certainly didn't pretend to care. Some nobles fumed at her blatant disregard, their faces twitching in barely contained outrage. Others, the more experienced archdukes, merely smirked. After all, they had pulled the same act in their youth. Meanwhile, her siblings, Avalon and Kevin, could only shake their heads. They said nothing, knowing full well that Rimuru was entirely aware of what she was doing. It was, in essence, a masterclass in disrespect, a power play wrapped in sheer disinterest. And it worked. The lower-ranking nobles fumed but held their tongues, unable to challenge the raw authority her attitude projected. Then, the air shifted. The grand royal doors, doors that only the royal family could touch, let alone use, slowly creaked open. King Alfred and Queen Sarah stepped inside, their expressions sharp and serious. The room fell into hushed anticipation. But as their eyes landed on their children, their stern expressions softened, ever so slightly. It seemed the real show was about to begin. As the royal couple settled onto their thrones, King Alfred wasted no time. With a quick surge of magic, his voice echoed throughout the grand hall. Welcome, my fellow brethren. We shall now commence the royal conference and determine the path our great nation shall take in the coming years. Quote. That snapped everyone to attention. Whatever lingering frustration over Rimuru's earlier display of disinterest was quickly forgotten. Every noble present, regardless of rank, straightened up, their focus entirely on the royal couple. Even the archdukes, seasoned as they were, shifted their full attention forward. Rimuru, too, sat up slightly, intrigued. I shouldn't speak here. I want to see how these nobles try to persuade Papa to follow their ideas and push their laws. Single quote. She was well aware of how nobles could climb the ranks in the kingdom. The usual methods were straightforward: military achievements, significant contributions to national success, or, in times of peace, the ever-popular arranged marriages. These three were the standard across all kingdoms. But in this kingdom, there was another, rarer path to power. A noble could prove their worth by demonstrating their ruling capabilities and their vision for the empire's future. And the royal conference was the stage where they had their chance. Here, nobles from all territories, regardless of rank, brought forth the latest gathered intelligence, engaging in debates over the kingdom's next course of action. It wasn't just about new discoveries, the assembly also decided on the creation, reinforcement, or even removal of laws. Or, to put it in more modern terms, this was the kingdom's version of parliament, only with more egos, more scheming, and significantly fewer bathroom breaks. With that, Alfred gave a nod to the current prime minister, Edric Agaraz, the former head of the prestigious Agaraz family. Edric wasted no time. He swept his gaze over the gathered nobles before glancing at the slate-like device in his hands, a runic slate. With a simple tap, the air shimmered as a projection materialized before their eyes. But this wasn't just a display of still images. Some were fully animated videos, and others were even live feeds. Rimuru couldn't help but be impressed. Humanity's come a long way, huh? Single quote. Technology like this was still a luxury, reserved only for nobles and elites, but the mere fact that such a device existed meant that someone out there had a vision. No matter how intelligent a person was, without imagination, creativity, or an understanding of what people wanted, they wouldn't be able to invent something like this. And ever since its first creation, countless minds had been working to make these devices more affordable while maintaining quality. From what little she had investigated, some companies had made progress in lowering costs. Even so, they were still far too expensive. Only the wealthiest commoners, high-ranking knights or successful merchants, could realistically afford one. Maybe I should get involved too, maybe even introduce video games while I'm at it. As of this moment, the primary matter at hand is the defeat of the kingdom of Kreris at the hands of Gloria. For further details on the event and its subsequent aftermath, copies of the report are being sent to all of you now. Quote. The moment those words left Edric's mouth, the nobles' eyes snapped toward their runic slates as the report was holographically transmitted. Some, however, stole quick glances in Rimuru's direction, trying to gauge her reaction. To their mild confusion, she looked pleasantly surprised. Are elves just naturally gifted at intelligence gathering? Most of this information is either accurate or at least dangerously close to the truth. Even the speculation is well crafted. I bet even Soe would be impressed by this level of work. As minutes passed, the nobles reread the report multiple times to fully grasp its implications. Then, without delay, the discussion kicked off. Since Gloria never requested our aid, neither in manpower nor resources, should we really be discussing this? Shouldn't we just leave it in Her Majesty's hands? Quote. What are you saying? Kriris has been defeated, and it'll take them years to recover. But what about the other kingdoms? Should we really just sit back and do nothing? If we let this slide, won't it embolden them to act against us in the future? Quote. Exactly. If we act now, we can cut off a potential problem before it festers. And even if we're overreacting, showing a firm stance will make sure they think twice before stepping out of line. Quote. The discussion quickly escalated into a flurry of arguments, with some archdukes offering their own measured opinions before slipping back into silence. Meanwhile, the royal family merely observed the nobles pacing about, each trying their best to sound intelligent, pragmatic, and deeply invested in the people's well-being. Of course, this wasn't entirely selfless. After all, the kingdom had laws allowing citizens to openly protest against nobles, provided they obtained a permit from the royal castle. And history had proven that the peasantry wasn't afraid to use that right. Many noble houses had suffered severe declines due to large-scale strikes, with entire villages refusing to work or outright migrating elsewhere. Some houses had taken years to recover, if they recovered at all. One particularly infamous example was a noble family that had only recently clawed its way back to stability. The former head had implemented a slew of unpopular laws, pushing the commoners to the breaking point. It was only after the new head repealed those laws and introduced more reasonable policies, such as providing fully funded housing for elderly citizens, that public opinion shifted. Sure, that move had landed them in crippling debt, but with the revenue they were pulling in now, they were steadily paying it off. Lesson learned. Pissing off the common folk had very real consequences. Another crucial lesson they had learned was the art of masking their true thoughts and opinions, an essential skill in politics. While power and influence were important, the real game lay in maintaining control without resistance. Implementing laws that directly benefited the peasantry not only fostered goodwill but also proved to be a highly profitable long-term strategy. After all, even if a noble was the most despicable tyrant to ever exist, the common folk wouldn't dare rebel as long as his rule brought them tangible benefits. Oppression alone wouldn't guarantee loyalty, but a system that genuinely improved their lives while subtly reinforcing dependency. That was true mastery. Creating a tax-paying territory was difficult enough, but forging a population so loyal that they would willingly follow orders and pay taxes without question. That was an entirely different level of governance. In short, enact laws that favor the peasants, and they will happily fund their own servitude. Now that I think about it, why doesn't anyone else do something like this? Rimuru mused, feeling a bit baffled. It was such a simple and effective strategy that she figured anyone with a decent amount of intelligence should have thought of it by now. After all, nobles only got rich because of the peasants. The richer the peasants, the richer the nobles, it was basic logic. Before she could spiral further into her own thoughts, Atticus spoke up, cutting through the ongoing discussion. If we can't come to an agreement, why not seek Lady Gloria's opinion? Quote. At his words, the nobles all turned to him before their gazes collectively shifted toward Rimuru, who still looked utterly uninterested, like the whole Kriris situation was someone else's headache. Seeing this, a few of the more scheming nobles exchanged subtle smiles before playing along with Bale's suggestion. That's right. Since she handled the war, it's only natural that she handles the aftermath as well. Quote. Indeed, given her great feat in transforming Gloria into its current state, who else would be more suited for the task? Quote. It makes sense. She's already proven more than capable. Quote. More and more nobles began voicing their agreement, and even some of the archdukes nodded in approval. From their perspective, it was only fair, she finished the war, so she should tie up the loose ends too. Alfred observed the growing consensus and, after a brief moment, nodded. Even as her father, he had to act impartially in matters like these. Lady Gloria, will you accept this task? His tone was diplomatic, treating her not as his daughter but as another noble. At that, Rimuru let out an amused snort before standing up and offering a graceful bow. Gladly, I'd rather not entrust such a delicate task to people who lack the qualifications or the abilities. A stunned silence filled the room before. You. Quote. That's. Quote. Several nobles looked like they were about to explode on the spot, their faces turning various shades of red, while a few of the archdukes barely suppressed their laughter, while her siblings could only look on in worry. Rimuru, meanwhile, remained utterly unfazed. In fact, she seemed to be enjoying this. With a lazy stretch, she rolled her shoulders and flashed them all a smile so sweet it could have given them cavities. Did I say something wrong? She asked, voice dripping with feigned innocence. A heavy silence followed, thick with suppressed fury and disbelief. The more composed nobles merely sighed, either used to Rimuru's antics or wise enough to avoid engaging in what was clearly a losing battle. Alfred, for his part, resisted the urge to snicker. Instead, he cleared his throat and gave Rimuru a pointed look. Lady Gloria, I trust you will handle this matter with the necessary diplomacy. Quote. Rimuru grinned. But of course, she straightened up and flicked her wrist dramatically. I'll make sure everything is dealt with properly. You have my word. Something about the way she said it made some of the nobles shift uncomfortably in their seats. Others, particularly the more experienced ones, simply sighed again. They knew that when it came to Rimuru, properly could mean many things. At Rimuru's blatant display of superiority, some nobles clenched their fists in frustration, while others barely reacted, keeping their eyes fixed forward. The air in the room grew tense, but before the atmosphere could ignite into something messier, Edric continued, his voice cutting through the commotion. The demonic gates leading to the underworld have begun to activate at an increasing rate. As far as we can tell, only we have noticed this, though there is a small possibility that the church has also become aware. Quote. At those words, the entire room shifted. The war of Cyrus and Gloria were important, but this was different. The mention of the underworld sent a chill through even the most composed of nobles. Memories, ancient stories passed down through bloodlines, came rushing back. The demon king Diablo, a being so terrifying that even before the gods arrived and granted their blessings, had nearly swallowed the world whole. It took a summoned hero to stop him back then, and now, the gates to that nightmare were stirring once more. Silence reigned for a moment before the nobles erupted into debate. We need to mobilize our armies immediately. If we prepare in advance and send spies to investigate, we can formulate a plan, perhaps even neutralize the threat before it fully emerges. Quote. Neutralize. Do you hear yourself? The underworld isn't some rogue nation that we can just infiltrate and manipulate from the shadows. One misstep, and we'd be the ones crushed instead. Quote. Then what? Do nothing and wait for hell itself to spill into our lands. Quote. No, but running in blind is no different from suicide. We need information first. If we rush this, we could be playing into their hands. Quote. Another noble quickly interjected, his voice carrying the weight of consideration rather than panic. Shouldn't we also inform the other kingdoms? If the demonic gates truly threaten to open, this is a global issue, not just ours. A collective effort might be the only way we all survive. Quote. Oh yes, brilliant idea. Let's just go knocking on the doors of our dear rivals and hand them proof that we're the first to notice. You think they'll see us as allies? No, they'll see us as a threat, that we have more knowledge and influence than them. If we're not careful, we'll be dealing with politics and demons at the same time. Quote. So your answer is to sit in a corner and do nothing. Quote. No, my answer is to act smart, not desperate. We don't need every single kingdom involved yet, just the right ones. Quote. Murmurs spread across the room as some nobles nodded in agreement, while others looked even more skeptical. And who exactly are the right ones? Quote. The ones with something to lose. Those who would be just as desperate as us to stop this before it becomes unstoppable. Quote. So, the Holy Church, then. Quote. The room went still. The idea of working alongside the Church, an entity that had its own long and complicated history with Tempest, left an uncomfortable taste in many of their mouths. Quote. Do we really want to involve them? Someone muttered under their breath. Do we have a choice? Another shot back. Tension hung thick in the air as the nobles continued to debate, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. The Demon King was a legend, a nightmare of the past, but if the gates were rising once more, they could soon become a nightmare of the present. As the nobles continued to argue with no clear resolution in sight, Alfred finally decided to intervene. Even with the divine blessing of wisdom, he knew that this was not a decision to be made on impulse. No matter how intelligent or well-informed one was, sometimes the best course of action was to pause and allow time for consideration. All of you, stop. Quote. Silence fell immediately. The weight of his authority crushed the discussion in an instant. We are shelving this discussion until tomorrow. This matter is too important to be debated without proper thought. Take the night to process this information. Rushing a decision now will only lead to mistakes. Quote. The murmurs in the room started up again, but this time, they were ones of agreement rather than debate. Yes, the king is right. A rushed decision here could be disastrous. Quote. We need to come back with clearer heads. Quote. Agreed. Quote. Satisfied that order had been restored, Alfred gave a nod before shifting the focus back to Edric. Now then, as requested by Lady Avalon, the next topic for discussion, the alliance between the church and Flavius. Quote. With that, the meeting continued, though Rimuru hardly paid it any mind. She technically listened, recording everything through her ears, but that was more out of habit than genuine interest. After all, she was more than capable of memorizing everything in an instant, so what was the point of wasting energy paying attention to something that bored her? And so, she simply sat in silence, draped lazily over her chair, exuding an air of pure boredom. She only spoke when absolutely necessary, when directly addressed or when something so absurd was said that she couldn't help but comment on it. And so the hours dragged on. Debates, agreements, compromises, on and on it went. Until, finally, the meeting came to an end. As Rimuru slept peacefully in the castle, Altimia was already in motion, sprinting through the imperial corridors like a shadow in the night. Her footsteps barely made a sound as she weaved through the halls, her heartbeat steady despite the urgency of her mission. Without hesitation, she leapt through one of the many grand windows separating her from the outside world. The moment she did, a swirling portal appeared midair, engulfing her entirely. And then, hell itself. Molten lava bubbled beneath her, the ground fractured and scorched beyond recognition. Thick smoke and ash choked the sky, turning the air heavy with the stench of sulfur. Above, past the swirling plumes of darkness, the sky glowed a deep, violent red, the color of fresh blood, glistening in the light of an unseen, merciless sun. But none of that was what held Altimia's attention. No, what really caught her eye was the legions of monsters below. These weren't weaklings. No mere cannon fodder. These were powerful, grotesque beasts, brimming with bloodlust and raw, untamed magic. A true army, waiting. Good. I arrived just in time before they could mobilize. Single quote. She smirked. Just as planned. Before Rimuru had left for the castle, Altimia had briefed her on this exact scenario. A portal was set to open within the inner castle area, releasing thousands of magical beasts to sow destruction. In the game, even if the player did nothing, the castle wouldn't fall. Sure, it would take damage, flaming debris, broken walls, the usual, but thanks to the sheer number of powerful fighters stationed there, the threat would ultimately be neutralized. Especially now that Rimuru was around. This event wasn't meant to be a world-ending catastrophe, just a wake-up call. A warning to force the world to finally take the demonic gate situation seriously. But for players who knew what they were doing, this was an opportunity. If they were willing to throw away the defensive advantage, they could charge directly into the portal and wipe out the monsters at the source. A brutal, unforgiving battle. One that took place way too early in the game's timeline. For the average player, this was suicide. The difficulty spike was absurd. The enemies were overwhelmingly strong. Only a handful of people had ever pulled it off in the original game. But Altimia wasn't just some random player. She had been reincarnated into this world as a child, meaning she had years to prepare, years to break the system with every cheese strat imaginable. More importantly, she had trained under the absolute strongest teacher in existence, Rimuru Tempest. And thanks to that, she had mastered the single most broken sword style in the entire game. Tempest Arts. A grin spread across her face. Alright, then, let's get started. Quote. Altimia unsheathed her sword, its radiant edge catching the eerie crimson glow of the hellish landscape around her. This was no ordinary weapon, this was a blade crafted specifically for her by none other than Rimuru herself. A weapon born not out of necessity, but out of recognition, an acknowledgement of her valor in the war against Kriris. At first glance, the sword was a contradiction. An impossibly beautiful masterpiece, a blade so intricately designed that it looked unfit for the battlefield. Too elegant. Too pristine. It seemed more suited for ceremonial display than for the harsh reality of war. A work of art, meant to be admired. But beneath that breathtaking exterior lay something far more terrifying, absolute lethality. This was no mere ornament. This was a monster in the form of a blade. Unparalleled sharpness. Unbreakable durability. A weapon so refined, so perfect, that it could cleave through anything in the world with effortless precision. Metal, stone, flesh, magic, it didn't matter. Nothing could stand in its way. And at the heart of it all, Rimuru's own craftsmanship, a blade forged with care, power, and an unspoken promise. A gift. A reward. A testament to what Ultimia had become. Its name was as simple as it was absolute. The primeval holy sword, Altar. Ultimia gripped the hilt, exhaling slowly as the weight of the weapon settled into her hands. This was it. Time to see how well you cut. Quote. And with that, she descended into the inferno below. Gathering mana into her blade, Ultimia didn't bother with any complex technique or grandiose spell. She simply imbued her sword with magic, nothing more, nothing less. A basic enhancement, something so common it was practically instinct for any warrior with magical prowess. And yet, as the azure glow enveloped Altar, it shone with an intensity that immediately caught the attention of the countless monsters poised to storm through the portal into the castle. And then, like a falling star, she descended. A streak of azure light tore through the smoky sky, crashing into the ground with an impact that sent shockwaves rippling outward. Those unfortunate enough to be directly below her were obliterated in an instant, their bodies crushed beneath the sheer force of her landing. But the destruction didn't stop there. A wave of unseen energy expanded from her position, and in an instant, every monster surrounding her was cut down, not by the force of the impact, but by something far more insidious. It was as if Altar's mere presence had sliced through them. Ultimia stood at the center of the carnage, momentarily stunned. The sheer scale of destruction she had just unleashed was overwhelming. She hadn't used any grand techniques. No divine incantations. No reality-breaking spells. Just a simple attack. An ordinary strike infused with her own strength, a minor magic enhancement, and the power of Altar. This sword is ridiculous. Single quote. Shaking off her momentary awe, she leapt from the crater she had created, landing lightly on the scorched earth just as the rest of the horde charged toward her. Thousands upon thousands of monsters, their bloodlust ignited by her initial strike. The castle was still on the other side of the portal. To them, she was now the sole obstacle between their rampage and an easy feast. Ultimia smirked. This time, when Altar began to glow, it was different. The azure light from before was replaced by something otherworldly, something beyond human comprehension. It was not merely an enhancement, it was a radiance so pure, so absolute, that it transcended the limits of magic. A light that invoked an instinctive, primal fear in those who beheld it. The glow of holiness, of an absolute being. She raised her blade. And with a single swing, everything died. There was no grand explosion. No tidal wave of destruction. No visible force to explain what had just occurred. One moment, the monsters were charging. The next, they simply ceased to exist. It wasn't that they were struck down. It wasn't even that they were destroyed. They had been cut, as if each and every one of them had been struck at their absolute weakest point by an attack perfectly tailored to kill them. It didn't matter if they had armor. If they had shields. If they were cloaked in magic barriers or even divine protection itself. Altar ignored it all. Its edge severed not just flesh and steel, but concepts. Distance. Meaningless. Defense. Irrelevant. Even something as abstract as death itself was just another thing for the blade to cut through. It was an entirely unreasonable weapon. A sword that had no right to exist in this world. And yet, in Ultimia's hands, it was a fact. She exhaled, lowering her sword slightly as the battlefield fell into an eerie silence. Quote. Well, she tilted her head, admiring the sheer emptiness before her. That was a bit much. Quote. But as she turned, she caught movement in the distance. A single monster. Still standing. And grinning. Ultimia didn't hesitate. The moment she saw that monster grin at her, grin after surviving Altar, she turned and bolted. This wasn't an opponent she could face alone. If there truly existed a being that could withstand Altar, a sword that ignored defense, distance, and even the very concept of survival, then it was a monster that surpassed any logic she knew. Not even the strongest bosses from the game had been described as capable of such a feat. Chloe could handle this. Rimuru could handle this. But she needed to get the hell out of here. Her legs carried her toward the portal, her body moving faster than ever before. The battlefield blurred around her as adrenaline surged through her veins. Then, instinct screamed. She ducked. A fraction of a second later, something sliced through the space where her head had just been, fast enough to leave a shrieking vacuum in its wake. Unnatural. Without thinking, she twisted her body and countered with a slash. Alter's blade flashed, carving through the monster in a single, perfect stroke. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the two halves of the creature split apart, falling to the ground with a dull, wet sound. She exhaled sharply, steadying her stance. That was close. Not bad, you're truly worthy of that weapon. The voice that followed sent a chill through her spine. It wasn't demonic. It wasn't divine. It wasn't anything that should exist in this world. But thanks to you, I was forced to reveal myself and not get anything out of it at all. What? Ultimia's mind raced. This wasn't in the game. No boss, no secret event, nothing in any of her playthroughs had ever hinted at something like this. At first, she had assumed her interference in the timeline had simply caused hidden characters or unknown variables to shift. But now, she wasn't so sure. Then, before she could even react. And so, I will be taking that. Pain. Excruciating pain. A clawed hand plunged into her chest before she could even process what had happened. One instant, she had been staring at a field of corpses. The next, it was right in front of her. Her body convulsed as blood spilled from her lips, her breath hitching in sheer agony. Gah! Gritting her teeth, she forced her arm to move. Alter flashed as she swung, aiming to carve through the entity even at this range. It should have been absolute. It should have been unstoppable. It should have cut through anything. Instead, the creature simply grabbed the blade with its bare hand. And stopped it completely. Ultimia's breath caught in her throat. That was impossible. She had seen Alter erase armies, cleave through monsters beyond human comprehension, sever even the most protected beings as if they were made of paper. Yet this thing had just grabbed it. With one hand. And it wasn't even trying. Ultimia's shock must have been obvious because the creature grinned, as if drinking in her disbelief. Shocking, right? That something like this could be blocked by little old me. Quote. Its voice was wrong. A distorted whisper, a melodic hum, a chorus of echoes that didn't belong to anything from this world. It truly is a shocking and demonic event, but unfortunately, only you were able to see it. And then, it twisted its claws deeper into her chest. The monster had no time to process what had happened next. One moment, it had been gripping Alter, defying all logic. The next, its arm was gone. Blood gushed from the stump, spraying across the battlefield. The severed limb, still clutching the legendary blade, tumbled to the ground with a wet thud. Huh. Quote. The monster's distorted voice wavered in confusion. Huh. Quote. Ultimia echoed the sentiment. Neither of them understood what had just happened. Then, before comprehension could dawn, before the monster could react, a hand appeared before its face. It hadn't moved. It hadn't appeared in the traditional sense. It simply was. A presence beyond time, beyond space. A force of absolute dominion. The hand clenched. And in that single motion, the monster ceased to be. Not just in body. Not just in spirit. But in concept. It wasn't simply killed. It was erased. Like it had never existed in the first place. Like the world itself had never acknowledged it. Like the very idea of it had never been born. Ultimia blinked. She was walking. Not running. Not bleeding. Not fighting for her life. Just walking. The battlefield stretched before her, but something was wrong. No, something was missing. She wasn't gasping for breath. She wasn't drenched in blood. She wasn't running from something. What was she doing again? Her mind searched for a reason, some trace of the battle she knew she had been fighting, but found nothing. Then, she saw her. Ahead of her, as if it was the most natural thing in the world, Rimuru was walking toward her. Casually. Elegantly. As if they were merely meeting in a peaceful courtyard rather than the middle of a war-torn battlefield. Rimuru-sama. Quote. She stopped in her tracks, confusion flickering across her face. Why was Rimuru here? One moment, she had been fighting, right. She had drawn her sword, had fought an army, had Ultimia's gaze flickered down at her hands. No wounds. Her armor. Perfectly intact. Her body. Brimming with vitality. She had been somewhere else just moments ago. Hadn't she? But no. That didn't make sense. She had always been here. Right here. The thought of running, of fighting something more terrifying than she could comprehend, of having her chest pierced through, it all vanished like a half-remembered dream. The battlefield, the war, the enemies, everything was normal. The world itself forgot. So, of course, she forgot too. With an easy, natural movement, she sheathed altar. And then, with a radiant smile, one untouched by any fear, pain, or confusion, she calmly strode toward her liege. Rimuru-sama. Why are you here? She called out, as if greeting an old friend, not a savior who had just erased something that shouldn't exist. Rimuru's steps didn't break, their presence unchanged, absolute and untouchable. Then, with an elegant, dramatic smile, they replied. Why should I be? I'm only here to see if my precious weapon works wonders. The words were light-hearted, almost teasing. But beneath them, in that space where something once existed but no longer did, there was an undeniable truth. Something should have happened. Something did happen. But now, it never had.